The glass doors of the Mercedes dealership slammed shut behind him. The former NBA great, Jamal Carter, stood frozen, his towering 6'8" frame casting a long shadow under the dealership's bright showroom lights. His heart pounded, but not from exhaustion like in his playing days. This was different. It was rage, humiliation. "Sir, I've already told you." The manager, a middle-aged woman with sharp eyes and a fake smile, sneered. "We don't entertain people who browse and waste our time." Jamal clenched his fists, taking a deep breath to calm himself. He had heard that tone before, when he was a young black kid trying to prove himself on the court, when people doubted his worth beyond basketball. But here, in a dealership where he had planned to spend his hard-earned money, he had walked in dressed in a simple tracksuit and sneakers, nothing flashy. But the moment he stepped through the doors, he could feel the stares, the judging eyes, the assumptions. "What do you mean, people like me?" Jamal asked, his voice low but firm. The manager smirked. "Oh, don't play dumb. We know when someone's just looking around, hoping to touch things they can't afford." Jamal's jaw tightened. He had bought luxury cars before. He had the money, the means, but she didn't see a successful man. She saw a black man, and in her mind, that meant trouble. "Now, I'll kindly ask you to leave before I call security," she added, crossing her arms. "We don't need loiterers here." Jamal stared at her, his blood boiling. He had seen and experienced racism before, but this was outright disrespect. He could have walked away. He could have ignored it. But then he thought about his son, Malcolm, the Attorney General of the state. Malcolm had worked his whole life to fight injustice, to change the system. But even with all his success, he too had faced racism. The world had judged him before knowing him, just like they were doing to Jamal now. And this moment would not go unnoticed. Jamal took a step forward, towering over the woman. "You're making a big mistake," he said, his voice steady but firm. "Oh, I doubt that," she scoffed, pulling out her phone. "I'll make sure you never step foot in here again." Jamal exhaled, shaking his head. "We'll see about that." And with that, he turned and walked toward the exit. But before he stepped out, he pulled out his phone and dialed a number. "Malcolm," he said as the line connected. "We have a problem." The morning had started peacefully. Jamal had woken up in his quiet suburban home, sipping coffee on the porch while watching the sun rise. Retirement had given him a life of peace, one he had earned after years of grueling practices and games. But today was special. He was looking for a new car, something sleek, something smooth. He had been eyeing a Mercedes for a while now. He grabbed his keys and headed toward the dealership, never expecting the storm waiting for him. Malcolm Carter sat in his office, the towering bookshelves behind him filled with legal volumes and framed photographs of his achievements. As the youngest attorney general in the state's history, he had seen his fair share of injustices, but hearing his father's voice on the phone sent a wave of fury through him. "Wait, what happened?" Malcolm asked, gripping his pen tightly. Jamal explained the situation, his voice calm but filled with an unmistakable edge. "She looked at me like I didn't belong there, son, like I was some kind of criminal." Malcolm shut his eyes, a flood of memories rushing in. He had been on the receiving end of that look too many times. In law school, walking into courtrooms, even in his own office, people questioning his presence, doubting his legitimacy. And now, they had done it to his father. "This isn't going to slide," Malcolm said, standing up. "I'll meet you at home." Meanwhile, at the dealership, the manager, Linda Marsh, was in her office, sipping coffee with a smug smile. She had dealt with his kind before, people who thought money erased their place in society. She prided herself on keeping the dealership clean from unnecessary trouble. She had no idea the storm that was about to hit. Jamal sat in his living room, rubbing his temples as Malcolm paced back and forth. His son was livid, his sharp feature tight with anger. She had no idea who she was talking to, Malcolm muttered, shaking his head. And she thought she could get away with it. Jamal sighed. "Son, I've faced worse in my life. This isn't the first time someone looked at me like I didn't belong. And that's the problem," Malcolm shot back. "It keeps happening, and it's happening to the wrong person this time." Malcolm grabbed his phone and started typing furiously. "I want to know everything about that dealership. Their policies, their history, If this has happened before, Jamal watched his son work, feeling a mix of pride and sadness. He had raised Malcolm to fight for what was right, but it hurt that even after all his success, his son still had to fight these same battles. Meanwhile, Linda Marsh was finishing her shift, completely unaware of the chaos she had set in motion. She laughed with her co-workers, recounting the incident as if it were a joke. "You should have seen his face," she said smugly, like he actually thought he could afford something here. Her laughter was cut short when a call came through to her office. It was the dealership owner. "Linda, I just got off the phone with the Attorney General's office." His voice was tight with frustration. "Do you have any idea what kind of mess you just made?" Linda's smirk faded instantly. "What?" Jamal Carter, former NBA player, multi-millionaire. "And his son? Malcolm Carter? The Attorney General of this state." Linda's face went pale. I didn't know." The voice on the other end didn't hold back. "Well, now you do. And trust me, Linda, you're going to regret it." Linda's hands trembled as she set down her phone. The color drained from her face. This wasn't just another customer complaint. This was a career-ending mistake. Before she could react, the dealership doors swung open and in walked Malcolm Carter, his presence commanding immediate attention. Every employee turned to stare. Whispers spread like wildfire. "Is that? Oh my God, that's the Attorney General!" Linda scrambled out of her office, trying to appear calm. But Malcolm's eyes locked onto her like a predator spotting its prey. "Ms. Marsh," he said coldly, "we need to talk." Linda swallowed hard, her fake confidence slipping. She had no idea how to get out of this. Linda's breath hitched as Malcolm took a step closer, his gaze sharp and unforgiving. The weight of the moment crushed her usual arrogance, leaving her grasping for words. I didn't realize who he was," she stammered. Malcolm's expression darkened. "And if he weren't my father, would that make what you did any less disgusting?" The room was silent. Employees watched in stunned silence, waiting for the inevitable fallout. Linda sat frozen in her office chair, her fingers trembling over the keyboard. The weight of her mistake crushed her chest like a boulder. She had seen Malcolm Carter's name in the news before, but never connected the dots. Now, it was too late. "You know what bothers me the most?" Malcolm finally spoke, his voice calm yet firm. "It's not just what you did to my father. It's the fact that you've probably done this before, to others who didn't have the means to fight back." Linda's face flushed. I never meant—" Malcolm cut her off. "You meant exactly what you did. You saw a black man in your dealership and assumed he didn't belong." The words hung in the air, thick with accusation. Linda opened her mouth, but nothing came out. She was cornered, and she knew it. The dealership owner, Robert Whitman, stepped into the office, his expression a mix of frustration and fear. He had built this dealership's reputation for years, and in one afternoon, Linda had managed to drag it through the mud. "Mr. Carter," Robert said, extending a hand, but Malcolm ignored it. "I want to assure you that this is not how we conduct business here." Malcolm raised an eyebrow. "Is that so? Because it seems like your manager felt very comfortable discriminating against my father." Robert turned to Linda, his jaw tightening. "You're fired. Effective immediately." Linda's mouth fell open. What? You've put this dealership in a position I can't recover from," Robert snapped. "Pack your things and leave." She turned to Malcolm, eyes pleading. "Please, I wasn't thinking. It was a mistake." Malcolm shook his head. "No, Ms. Marsh. A mistake is spilling coffee on a customer. What you did was a choice." Linda sat frozen, her world crumbling around her, but the storm wasn't over yet. Malcolm stepped closer, his next words slicing through the room. "My office will be launching a full investigation into this dealership's practices. If I find out that my father wasn't the first person you treated this way, there will be legal consequences." Robert swallowed hard. "Mr. Carter, I assure you we'll cooperate fully." "See that you do," Malcolm said, turning on his heel. "Because I'm not done yet." With that, he walked out, leaving Linda staring at the empty doorway, her career and reputation in ruins. Jamal Carter leaned against his car, watching through the glass as his son took control of the situation. He had always known Malcolm was meant for greatness, but seeing him fight for justice firsthand filled him with an overwhelming sense of pride. Malcolm stepped outside, his expression still tight with controlled anger. "It's done," he said simply. Jamal nodded, but there was something else in his son's eyes, something unresolved. "What's next?" he asked. Malcolm exhaled slowly. "I want to make sure this doesn't happen to anyone else. Not here, not anywhere." Jamal placed a hand on his son's shoulder. "Then let's make sure of it." As they stood there, the weight of generations behind them, father and son knew this was bigger than just one dealership. This was about change, and they weren't stopping anytime soon. The media storm erupted the very next morning. News outlets had caught wind of the incident, and soon, Malcolm Carter's face was plastered across every major network. Attorney General's father kicked out of dealership in racial dispute. The headline was everywhere. Social media exploded with outrage, support, and predictably, denial from those who refused to believe racism still existed in such blatant forms. Malcolm sat in his office, his phone vibrating with constant calls. He had expected attention, but not like this. His secretary peeked in. "Sir, you have reporters outside the building." Malcolm sighed. "How many?" She hesitated. "Dozens." Jamal, who was sitting across from him, chuckled. "You wanted to make sure this never happened again. Looks like the whole world is watching now." Malcolm ped his fingers on his desk. "Good. That means we have a chance to do something real." Just then, a new call came in. "The governor's office?" Malcolm exchanged a glance with his father before picking up. "This is Malcolm Carter." The voice on the other end was steady but firm. "Malcolm, we need to talk." Jamal watched as his son's expression hardened. Whatever was coming next wasn't going to be easy. Malcolm stood by his office window, gripping his phone tightly. The governor's voice was calm but laced with an unmistakable tension. "Malcolm, the incident at the dealership has turned into a national conversation. Civil rights groups are getting involved, and the pressure is mounting." "That's exactly what needs to happen," Malcolm replied evenly. "People need to see this for what it is." The governor sighed. "I understand, but we have to be careful. You're not just a private citizen anymore. You're the Attorney General. Your actions reflect on the entire administration." Malcolm's jaw tightened. "So what are you saying? That I should let this go?" "No," the governor said quickly. "I'm saying we need to be strategic. You have my support, but we need to handle this in a way that brings real change, not just headlines." Malcolm exhaled, his mind racing. "Then let's talk solutions." The governor hesitated before responding. "Meet me in my office this afternoon. We'll figure out the next steps." As Malcolm hung up, Jamal spoke up from across the room. "What did he say?" Malcolm turned, determination burning in his eyes. "He wants to meet. Says he supports me, but we need to be careful." Jamal nodded slowly. "Then let's see if he really means it." Meanwhile, outside the Attorney General's office, the protest had begun. A crowd had gathered, holding signs that read, "Justice for Jamal" and "End Racism in Business." Cameras flashed, reporters pushed forward, and the energy in the air was electric. But in the midst of it all, hidden among the crowd, was a figure watching Malcolm closely. A man with a different agenda. And he was waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The figure in the crowd pulled his hoodie tighter around his face, his sharp eyes fixed on Malcolm as he stepped out of his office. The energy of the protest had reached a fever pitch, but beneath the chants and flashing cameras, danger lurked. Malcolm walked forward, shaking hands with a few activists before stepping onto a makeshift podium. He raised his hands for silence, and the crowd gradually quieted, eager to hear him speak. "I want to thank everyone for being here today," Malcolm began, his voice steady but passionate. "This is not just about my father. This is about every person who has ever been judged unfairly, treated as less than, simply because of the color of their skin. And we are here to say, enough is enough." The crowd erupted in cheers, but amidst the applause, the hooded figure moved closer, slipping through the bodies unnoticed. His hands clenched into fists as he reached into his pocket. Meanwhile, across the street, Jamal Carter stood watching his son with immense pride. But something felt off. Years of experience had sharpened his instincts, and right now, those instincts screamed danger. He scanned the crowd, his eyes locking onto the lone figure weaving his way toward Malcolm. His heart pounded. Something was wrong. At that moment, Malcolm continued, "We are taking action. An investigation has already begun into discriminatory practices in businesses across this state. We will not stop until justice is served. Another round of cheers erupted, but Jamal wasn't focused on the speech anymore. He was moving, fast, pushing through the throng of people, his eyes locked on the figure now just feet away from Malcolm. And then it happened. A metallic glint flashed in the figure's hand. Jamal shouted, "Malcolm, look out!" The crowd gasped. The air seemed to freeze in place. A loud bang shattered the moment. Malcolm stumbled back, a shocked expression on his face as chaos erupted around him. People screamed. Cameras swung wildly. Security rushed forward. Jamal reached his son just as Malcolm clutched his side, eyes wide with pain. The hooded figure was tackled to the ground, but the damage had been done. Malcolm was hit. As sirens blared in the distance, the world watched in horror. Jamal cradled Malcolm in his arms, pressing a hand against his son's side, where blood was quickly soaking through his shirt. "Stay with me, son," he murmured, his voice shaking. Malcolm's breathing was shallow, his face twisted in pain, but he managed a weak nod. I'm okay, Dad," he whispered, though the agony in his voice betrayed him. The chaos around them blurred. Reporters shouting, police officers tackling the gunman, protesters screaming. Jamal's world had narrowed to just one thing, keeping his son alive. Paramedics pushed through the crowd, quickly assessing Malcolm's wound. "We need to move him now," one of them shouted. Jamal refused to let go until they loaded Malcolm onto the stretcher. Even then, he stayed close, climbing into the ambulance alongside his son. The doors slammed shut, the sirens wailed, and the vehicle sped toward the hospital. Meanwhile, back at the protest site, police officers dragged the shooter to his feet. His hoodie had fallen back, revealing a pale, freckled face twisted in anger. "He's ruining everything," the shooter spat. "This country doesn't need people like him in power." The officer restraining him tightened his grip. "You just tried to kill the Attorney General. You're finished." Inside the ambulance, Malcolm's vision blurred as he gritted his teeth against the pain. His father's face hovered above him, filled with worry. "You're strong, son. You're gonna be okay." Malcolm's lips parted as he tried to speak, but his vision darkened, and the last thing he heard before slipping into unconsciousness was his father calling his name. The hospital emergency room was a blur of frantic movement as Malcolm was rushed through the double doors. Nurses and doctors swarmed around him, their voices clipped and urgent. Jamal ran alongside the gurney, refusing to let his son out of his sight. "He's losing too much blood," a nurse shouted as they pushed through the hall. "We need to stabilize him now." A doctor turned to Jamal, placing a firm hand on his shoulder. "Sir, we need you to wait outside. We'll do everything we can." Jamal's hands clenched into fists, but he nodded, stepping back as the team disappeared into the operating room. The doors swung shut, leaving him standing in a cold, sterile hallway with nothing but his racing thoughts. He sank into a chair, his head in his hands. Every moment felt like an eternity. Minutes turned into an hour, then two. A familiar voice snapped him out of his trance. "Dad." Jamal looked up to see Maya, Malcolm's younger sister, rushing toward him, her eyes red with tears. She had been out of town for a conference, but the moment she heard the news, she had driven straight to the hospital. "Is he okay?" she choked out. Jamal swallowed hard. "I don't know yet. He's still in surgery." Maya sank into the chair beside him, gripping his hand. "He's strong, Dad. He's going to make it." Just then, the doors to the operating room opened, and the lead surgeon stepped out, peeling off his gloves. His expression was unreadable. Jamal and Maya jumped to their feet. "Doctor, please tell me." Jamal's voice cracked. The doctor took a deep breath. "We managed to remove the bullet. He lost a lot of blood, but he's stable. For now." Jamal exhaled, his knees nearly buckling with relief. But the doctor wasn't finished. "However," he continued, "there's still a risk of internal damage. The next 24 hours will be critical." Jamal nodded, gripping Maya's hand tighter. "Can we see him?" The doctor hesitated before nodding. "One at a time, but only for a few minutes. He's still unconscious." Jamal stepped into the dimly lit hospital room. The steady beep of the heart monitor filled the silence. Malcolm lay motionless, his face pale, an oxygen mask over his mouth. Jamal sat beside him, taking his son's hand in his own. "You're a fighter, Malcolm. You hear me? You've come too far to let this stop you." A single tear slid down Jamal's cheek. Then suddenly, Malcolm's fingers twitched. Jamal's heart leaped. "Malcolm, can you hear me?" A soft groan escaped Malcolm's lips, his eyelids fluttering slightly. Jamal squeezed his hand. "That's it, son. Come back to us." And then, Malcolm's eyes slowly opened. Malcolm blinked, his vision hazy as he adjusted to the dim hospital room. The first thing he saw was his father's face, worried, relieved, and filled with a kind of exhaustion that spoke volumes. "Dad?" Malcolm's voice was hoarse, barely above a whisper. Jamal exhaled sharply, squeezing his son's hand. "You're awake. Thank God." Malcolm tried to sit up, but pain shot through his side, making him wince. "What happened?" Jamal's jaw tightened. "You were shot, son, but you're safe now." Malcolm's recovery was just beginning. The days following the surgery were a haze of medication, physical therapy, and difficult conversations. Though his body was healing, the emotional toll weighed heavily on him. His once steady hands now trembled, and the thought of returning to the public eye filled him with anxiety. Jamal and Maya remained by his side, offering unwavering support. But Malcolm knew that his fight wasn't over. The attack had ignited a fire in him, one that refused to be extinguished. As he sat in his hospital bed, watching the news report on his attempted assassination, Malcolm clenched his jaw. He wouldn't let fear dictate his path. Justice was still his mission, and he would return, stronger than ever. The steady beep of the heart monitor was a constant reminder that Malcolm was still here, still fighting. His body ached from the trauma, but his spirit burned hotter than ever. He had spent days confined to the hospital bed, listening to news reports about his attack, watching debates about whether his stance on racial justice had made him a target. Some called him a hero. Others claimed he was too radical. But Malcolm didn't care about labels. He cared about justice. A knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. His father, Jamal Carter, stepped in, looking more tired than Malcolm had ever seen him. The former NBA great had faced battles on the court. Boo. To nothing compared to the war he was fighting now. For his son, for their family, for their people. "You're awake," Jamal said, forcing a smile as he pulled up a chair. "Yeah," Malcolm replied, shifting uncomfortably. "I feel like I got hit by a truck." Jamal chuckled, though his eyes were filled with concern. "That's because you almost did." He sighed, rubbing his hands together. "You scared me, son. For a moment, I thought I was going to lose you." Malcolm exhaled slowly. "I'm still here, Dad, and I'm not giving up." Jamal nodded, gripping his son's shoulder. "Good, because they want you to be afraid. They want you to stay down, but that's not who we are." A soft knock at the door interrupted them again. This time, it was Maya, Malcolm's younger sister. She had barely left his side since the attack. Her eyes were red, but her expression was firm. "You've got people waiting to see you," she said gently. "The team's here. They want to talk strategy. And Mom's on her way." Malcolm tensed at the mention of his mother. She had always worried about his work, afraid that one day something like this would happen. He wasn't ready for that conversation yet. Jamal sensed his hesitation and patted his leg. "One thing at a time, son." Malcolm nodded. He took a deep breath. It was time to plan his next move. 2 weeks later, Malcolm stood in front of a crowd for the first time since the shooting. His body still ached, and a scar on his side was a reminder of how close he had come to death. But he refused to let fear win. The press conference was held on the steps of the courthouse. Dozens of reporters, activists, and supporters filled the space, waiting to hear from him. His father stood beside him, a pillar of strength, while Maya and his legal team stood nearby. Malcolm stepped up to the podium, gripping the edges tightly. Cameras flashed, microphones were raised, and the world held its breath. "I want to start by thanking everyone who has reached out to me and my family during this time," he began. His voice was strong, unwavering. "I was attacked because I refused to stay silent. I was attacked because I dared to challenge a system that has oppressed people like me for generations." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Some reporters exchanged glances, while others scribbled notes furiously. "But let me be clear," Malcolm continued. "I will not back down. I will not let this attack silence me. If anything, it has only made me more determined to fight for justice, for fairness, and for change." The crowd erupted in applause. Jamal smiled proudly, but Malcolm could see the worry in his father's eyes. He knew this fight wasn't over. In fact, It was only just beginning. Then, from the corner of his eye, Malcolm spotted something, or rather someone, standing at the edge of the crowd. A figure in a dark suit, arms crossed, watching him intently. His blood ran cold. It was the man who had threatened him before the attack. Their eyes met for a brief moment before the man smirked and disappeared into the crowd. Malcolm's heart pounded, but he kept his composure. This wasn't over, not even close. Later that night, Malcolm sat in his hotel room, staring out the window at the city skyline. His phone buzzed with messages of support, but his mind was elsewhere. The man at the press conference. Who was he? Was he connected to the shooter? A knock at the door made him jump. "Malcolm, it's me," Maya called. He opened the door and she stepped inside, holding a folder. "You need to see this." She placed the folder on the table and opened it, revealing a set of documents and photos. "This is the shooter's background report," she explained. "And look at this." She pointed to a photo of the man Malcolm had seen at the press conference. "His name is Richard Langley," she continued. "He's a lobbyist for a group that's been trying to push anti-voter laws, and guess what? He's been seen with the shooter before." Malcolm's jaw tightened. "So, the attack wasn't just random." Maya nodded. "They wanted to take you out. They wanted to scare you." Malcolm clenched his fists. "Then they failed." His father's words echoed in his head. "They want you to be afraid, but that's not who we are." He wasn't done fighting. If anything, he was just getting started. The next morning, Malcolm woke up to a knock on his door. When he opened it, he was met by two police officers. "Mr. Carter," one of them said, "we need you to come with us." Malcolm frowned. "What is this about?" The officer's expression was unreadable. "You're being investigated and for inciting violence." Malcolm's heart pounded. This was their next move. They couldn't kill him, so they were trying to destroy him another way, but he wasn't going down without a fight. Malcolm sat in the back of the police cruiser, his wrists bound in cold steel cuffs. The flashing lights reflected off the tinted windows as they sped through the city streets. He stared straight ahead, his mind racing. This was bigger than he had thought. First, they tried to silence him with a bullet. Now, they were trying to destroy his reputation. He exhaled slowly, steadying himself. He had been in battles before, legal, political, and personal. This was just another one. Inside the police station, Malcolm was led into a sterile white room. The officer uncuffed him and gestured for him to sit at the metal table. A moment later, a detective walked in. Detective Harris, according to his badge. He was a middle-aged man with graying hair and sharp blue eyes that studied Malcolm carefully. "You know why you're here," Harris said, dropping a thick file onto the table. Malcolm met his gaze. "Enlighten me." Harris opened the file, revealing photos of the protest, the shooting, and newspaper clippings. "We have reason to believe that your rhetoric directly led to violent retaliation against certain groups. That includes the attack on Senator Graham's office last night." Malcolm's brows furrowed. "What? I had nothing to do with that." Harris leaned in. "People are listening to you, Carter, and some of them are taking your words as a call to arms. The FBI is looking into whether you've been inciting violence." Malcolm let out a dry laugh. "So let me get this straight. I get shot in broad daylight for fighting against discrimination, and now I'm the criminal?" Harris tapped the file. "The evidence is piling up. You've been seen meeting with radical activist groups. You've spoken at events where tensions boiled over into riots. Now, an attack on a senator's office? You're becoming a problem." Malcolm's jaw clenched. "Or maybe I'm just a problem for the people trying to maintain a broken system." Harris smirked. "That's not for me to decide. But if I were you, I'd get a good lawyer." The door swung open before Malcolm could respond. Jamal Carter walked in, his face a storm of fury and determination. "This interview is over," he said firmly. "My son is leaving with me." Harris sighed, closing the file. For now, back at the hotel, Malcolm sat with Maya and their father, going over the situation. "They're setting me up," Malcolm said. "If I don't fight back, they'll bury me." Maya looked up from her laptop. "I've been digging into Langley, the man from the press conference. He has direct ties to Senator Graham. This whole thing is a political hit job." Jamal paced. "We need to be smart. If they're going after you legally, we need to fight back with facts. Public opinion is still on your side, but that can change fast." Malcolm exhaled. Then we go on the offensive. We expose them before they take me down. Maya nodded. I have some connections at major news outlets. If we leak the right information, we can control the narrative. Jamal folded his arms. Just be careful. The people coming after you don't play fair. Malcolm's eyes burned with resolve. Neither do I. The next morning, Malcolm received an anonymous message. I have proof that they set you up. Meet me alone at Pier 47 tonight. Malcolm's instincts screamed trap, but if there was even a chance this could clear his name, he had to take it. He slipped on his hoodie and grabbed his phone. Maya noticed him heading for the door. Where are you going? Malcolm hesitated. I need to handle something. Maya frowned. You're not going alone. But Malcolm was already gone. As he stepped into the night, heading toward the pier, he knew one thing for sure. This fight was just beginning. Malcolm sat in his office, the soft hum of the city beyond the windows filling the quiet space. The weight of everything, the attack, his recovery, the court battles, pressed against him like an invisible force. But he wasn't broken. If anything, he was more determined than ever. The television in the corner of the room flickered with breaking news. The case against the Mercedes dealership had taken center stage in the national conversation, sparking a heated debate about systemic racism in corporate America. Attorney General Malcolm Carter continues to push forward with the lawsuit against the dealership accused of discrimination. The case, which began after his father, former NBA star Jamal Carter, was wrongfully removed from the premises, has set a precedent for businesses across the country. Malcolm turned away from the screen, rubbing his temples. The battle was far from over. The dealership's legal team had been relentless, trying to twist the narrative, painting Jamal as an aggressive customer who had caused a scene. But Malcolm knew the truth. A knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. Come in, he called. The door opened, and Maya stepped inside, holding a stack of legal documents. You need to see this, she said, placing them on his desk. Malcolm glanced at the papers, his eyes narrowing. What is it? Maya exhaled sharply. We got access to the dealership's internal emails, and Malcolm, it's bad. She flipped through the pages, pointing to highlighted sections. There are messages from the manager, Jacqueline Mercer, where she explicitly says she doesn't want certain kinds of people coming in. She even instructs employees to watch black customers more closely, assuming they can't afford the cars. Malcolm's jaw tightened. We've got them. Maya nodded. But there's more. She handed him another document, her expression dark. This isn't just about the dealership anymore. The emails connect to corporate executives. This discrimination, it's part of a larger strategy. This goes all the way to the top. Malcolm took a slow breath, feeling the anger rise within him. This wasn't just about his father anymore. It was about every person who had been humiliated, turned away, or judged before they even spoke. He leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. If they think they can get away with this, Malcolm said, his voice steady, they're about to find out just how wrong they are. Maya smiled slightly, seeing the fire in her brother's eyes. So what's the next move? Malcolm tapped his fingers against the desk, then stood. We take this public. We expose them for who they really are. Maya nodded. Then let's get to work. As Malcolm grabbed his phone to make the call, he knew one thing for certain. This fight was far from over, and he was just getting started. The press conference was set for noon. By 10 a.m., the media had already gathered outside the state courthouse, their cameras pointed at the grand steps where Malcolm Carter was expected to speak. The world was watching. Inside his office, Malcolm adjusted his tie, his reflection staring back at him from the mirror. His father sat on the couch nearby, watching him closely. You ready for this? Jamal asked, his voice calm but serious. Malcolm turned, nodding. I have to be. Jamal exhaled, rubbing his hands together. I never thought walking into that dealership that day would lead to all of this. Malcolm walked over and placed a reassuring hand on his father's shoulder. They tried to humiliate you, Dad, but all they did was expose themselves, and now we have the proof to hold them accountable. Maya entered the room, holding her phone. We're set. The emails have been submitted to the courts as evidence, and I just got confirmation. Several former employees of the dealership are willing to testify about the discrimination they witnessed. Malcolm's expression hardened. Good. Then it's time. The moment Malcolm stepped outside, microphones were shoved toward him, reporters shouting over one another. Attorney General Carter, what new evidence do you have? Is it true that corporate executives were involved in the discrimination? Are you seeking criminal charges? Malcolm raised a hand, and the crowd gradually quieted. The flashing lights from the cameras made the moment feel even heavier. He cleared his throat and spoke with the confidence of a man who knew he had truth on his side. Ladies and gentlemen, today we are taking a stand against racial discrimination, not just in one dealership, but in a corporate system that has profited from prejudice for far too long, the reporters murmured, sensing the weight of his words. We have obtained internal emails proving that discriminatory practices were not isolated incidents, but part of a larger corporate strategy. We now have former employees stepping forward to confirm this truth. And let me be clear, this is not just a civil lawsuit anymore. My office is opening a criminal investigation into the executives behind this scheme. A shocked silence fell over the press. Then, chaos erupted. Criminal investigation? Who are the executives involved? Are you saying they broke federal law? Malcolm didn't flinch. We will be pursuing justice to the fullest extent of the law. No company, no executive, no system that thrives on racism is above accountability. As he stepped back, Jamal watched with pride. His son had turned a moment of injustice into a movement. But as Malcolm walked away from the podium, his phone buzzed in his pocket. He glanced at the number. It was unfamiliar. He answered. Attorney General Carter. A deep voice spoke on the other end. Calm but firm. You don't know who you're dealing with. Drop the case before it's too late. The line went dead. Malcolm stood still, gripping the phone. The fight had just escalated, and now the real battle was about to begin. Malcolm lowered the phone slowly, his mind racing. He replayed the voice in his head, calm, deliberate, but dripping with menace. You don't know who you're dealing with. Drop the case before it's too late. His father, Jamal, noticed the shift in his expression. What's wrong? Malcolm clenched his jaw, stuffing the phone into his pocket. Nothing. Let's get inside. Jamal narrowed his eyes but didn't push. They had just shaken the foundations of a billion-dollar company. There were bound to be consequences. As they walked into the courthouse, Malcolm felt the weight of unseen eyes watching him. Malcolm sat in his office, the city lights flickering beyond the windows. He stared at the call log on his phone, debating his next move. Whoever had called him wasn't just trying to intimidate him. They were warning him. But backing down wasn't an option. A knock at the door made him look up. Maya stepped in, holding a folder. I found something, she said, her voice low. Malcolm took the folder and flipped it open. His eyes widened as he scanned the contents. Inside were leaked documents, internal memos, financial reports, and a chain of emails between top executives of the dealership's parent company. They weren't just aware of the discriminatory practices, they had orchestrated them. More than that, there were payments, large sums of money wired to certain law enforcement officials and politicians. They were bribing people, Malcolm muttered. Maya nodded. And it goes higher than we thought. Malcolm's stomach tightened. This wasn't just about one dealership anymore. This was about an entire corrupt system designed to keep people like his father and countless others from having the same opportunities as everyone else. Before he could respond, his office phone rang. He hesitated, then picked up. This is Carter, a different voice this time, older, with a slight southern drawl. Son, you need to be careful about the fires you start. Some flames don't go out easy. Click. The line went dead. Malcolm exhaled, gripping the receiver. Maya frowned. Another threat? Malcolm nodded. They're scared. Good, she said. But Malcolm wasn't so sure, because people in power didn't get scared. They got dangerous. And he had just put himself, and everyone he loved, right in their crosshairs. The weight of the threats lingered in the air like an oncoming storm. Malcolm knew he had stepped on a landmine, one that could explode at any moment. Still, he couldn't stop now. The morning sun cast long shadows across the city as Malcolm, Maya, and Jamal gathered at the Attorney General's office. The leaked documents had opened a new door in their investigation. They weren't just going after the dealership anymore. They were about to expose a statewide conspiracy. As Malcolm sat at his desk, his legal team assembled around him, he laid out the plan. We need to file formal charges against the executives involved, he said. Bribery, discrimination, obstruction of justice, it's all here in black and white. One of the lawyers, a seasoned prosecutor named Linda Vega, shook her head. Malcolm, this isn't just a legal battle. These people have power. If you push them, they'll push back harder. I know, Malcolm said, but if we let them get away with it, we're no better than they are. Jamal, who had been silent until now, finally spoke. Son, I'm proud of you for doing this, but they've already tried to take you out once. What makes you think they won't try again? Malcolm met his father's eyes. Because this time, the world is watching. Jamal nodded, though concern lingered in his expression. Maya tapped her fingers on the table. We need a press conference. If we make this public before they can silence us, we take the power away from them. Linda sighed. It's risky, but it might be our best move. Malcolm made his decision. We go public. Today, a sea of reporters gathered outside the courthouse. Cameras flashed, microphones stretched forward, and the anticipation was electric. Malcolm stepped up the podium, adjusting his tie. He scanned the crowd, feeling the weight of every eye on him. Good afternoon, he began. Over the past few months, my office has been investigating reports of discrimination and unethical business practices. What we have uncovered is more than just an isolated incident. It is a system designed to oppress and exploit, the crowd murmured. Malcolm continued. Today, I am announcing legal action against not only the management of the Mercedes dealership, but also against several executives of its parent company, law enforcement officials who accepted bribes, and government figures who allowed this corruption to thrive. Gasps rippled through the press. He held up a thick folder. These documents contain undeniable proof. We will be pursuing criminal charges to the fullest extent of the law. A reporter raised a hand. Attorney General Carter, are you concerned about retaliation? Malcolm looked directly into the cameras. I won't be intimidated, I won't be silenced. Justice isn't for sale. The crowd erupted in questions, but before Malcolm could answer, something caught his eye. Across the street, a black SUV sat idling. The back window rolled down slightly, just enough for Malcolm to see the gleam of something metallic. A gun. His heart slammed into his ribs. Maya! Dad, get down! Malcolm shouted. A single shot rang out. Panic exploded in the crowd. Reporters screamed. Security rushed forward. Malcolm hit the ground, his father covering him as chaos erupted. The SUV sped off, tires screeching. Jamal helped Malcolm to his feet. Are you hit? Malcolm patted himself down, his breath ragged. No, I'm okay. Maya grabbed his arm. This was a warning. Malcolm clenched his fists. No, he said. This was proof that we're winning. The echoes of the gunshot still rang in Malcolm's ears as his security team ushered him, Jamal, and Maya into a blacked-out SUV. The press conference had turned into chaos, and though he wasn't hit, he knew what the message had been. Back off. Or else. But Malcolm Carter had never been one to back down. As the SUV sped away from the courthouse, his phone buzzed. It was Linda Vega. Malcolm, are you safe? She asked, her voice tense. For now, he replied, rubbing his temple. That was a direct threat. They're getting desperate, Linda said. That means we're close. Malcolm exhaled sharply. We need to move faster, file the charges, put out a warrant for everyone involved. Already in motion, Linda assured him. But Malcolm, these people aren't just rich executives. Some of them have ties to law enforcement and high-ranking officials. I don't care, Malcolm snapped. The law doesn't bend for the powerful. Not anymore. Jamal placed a hand on his son's shoulder. You're doing the right thing, son. But we need to be smart about this. They won't just come for you in the open next time. Maya, who had been quiet, looked up. Then we take away their ability to strike first. Malcolm raised an eyebrow. What are you thinking? She pulled out her phone, eyes locked on the screen. We expose everything. If they want to play dirty, we take it straight to the public. Uncensored. Undeniable. Malcolm nodded slowly. We leak the files. Maya smirked. Exactly. At exactly 9 p.m., Maya clicked a button. Within seconds, confidential documents, secret recordings, and incriminating emails flooded social media. News outlets picked up the story almost instantly. Corrupt officials, corporate executives, law enforcement officers caught red-handed. The country exploded. The next morning, Malcolm woke up to a dozen missed calls. He turned on the TV. Every major news channel was covering the leak. A bombshell report has just shaken the state's political and corporate world. Evidence of widespread corruption, discrimination, and bribery has surfaced, and the Attorney General's office is leading the charge in bringing those responsible to justice. Malcolm's phone rang again. It was Linda. "Malcolm," she said, breathless. "We've got them." Malcolm exhaled, the weight of months of fighting settling over him. But he knew one thing. This wasn't over yet. The sun had barely risen, but Malcolm was already awake, sitting in his office with a cup of black coffee. His phone hadn't stopped ringing since the leak. Some were from allies congratulating him. Others? Well, they weren't so friendly. A text from an unknown number flashed across his screen. "You have no idea what you've started. You will regret this." Malcolm stared at it for a moment before locking his phone. Regret? No. He wasn't afraid of them, but he knew the fight wasn't over. By noon, law enforcement, now under Malcolm's direct oversight, began making arrests. SWAT teams raided corporate offices, while state police escorted corrupt officials out of government buildings in handcuffs. News cameras captured every moment. The Mercedes dealership manager, the woman who had started all of this, was among the first arrested. As she was led out of her home, she tried to hide her face. Reporters shouted questions. "Do you regret what you did? Did you know who Jamal Carter was?" But she remained silent. Meanwhile, other powerful figures weren't as easy to bring in. Some had fled the state, others were using every legal loophole to stall their arrests. And then there was Vincent Caldwell, the billionaire who had funded the entire corrupt operation, the man who had ordered Malcolm's assassination attempt. He had disappeared. By evening, Malcolm was in a war room with Linda, Maya, and a team of investigators. "We traced Caldwell's jet to a private airstrip outside the city," an officer reported. "He's trying to leave the country." Malcolm's jaw clenched. Not happening. Within minutes, a convoy of unmarked vehicles raced toward the airstrip. Malcolm insisted on coming along. He wanted to see this through. As they arrived, they spotted Caldwell's private jet on the runway. The engines were roaring. He was seconds away from escaping. "Move in," Malcolm ordered. Officers swarmed the area. The jet's doors were still open, and just as Caldwell tried to board, armed agents grabbed him. "Vincent Caldwell," an officer announced. "You're under arrest for conspiracy, fraud, and attempted murder," Caldwell sneered. "You're making a mistake, Carter. You think this is over?" Malcolm stepped forward, staring him down. "No, this is just the beginning." As Caldwell was dragged away in handcuffs, Malcolm felt the weight of everything that had happened. His father had been humiliated. His family had been threatened. His life had nearly been taken. But he had won. Justice had won. And the fight for a better future had only just begun. 6 months had passed since the night Vincent Caldwell was arrested. The world had changed, at least in Malcolm Carter's corner of it. The courtroom had been packed during Caldwell's trial. The billionaire's legal team had thrown every trick in the book at the prosecution, but the evidence was overwhelming. The guilty verdict came swiftly: life in prison. And with that, the final piece of Malcolm's fight for justice had fallen into place. But justice was more than one man's conviction. The Mercedes dealership where Jamal Carter had been humiliated was now under new management. The old leadership, found guilty of discriminatory business practices, had been replaced. More importantly, Malcolm had helped pass the Equal Access Business Act, a new law that held businesses accountable for racial discrimination. One afternoon, Jamal stood outside the dealership, looking up at the sleek silver logo. This place had once been a symbol of his humiliation. Now, it was something more. "Mr. Carter?" A young black man in a crisp suit stepped outside, smiling. "I just wanted to say thank you. Because of you and your son, things are different now. I never thought I'd see this kind of change in my lifetime." Jamal smiled, gripping the young man's hand. "Son, we ain't done yet, but we're getting there." Malcolm sat in his office, watching the city skyline through his window. His scars had healed, but the memories remained. The battle against corruption and discrimination wasn't over. A knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. Maya walked in, carrying a folder. "I just got off the phone with the governor. They want you to consider running for Senate." Malcolm raised an eyebrow. "Senate? You've already changed the state," Maya said. "Why not change the whole country?" Malcolm chuckled, shaking his head. "One step at a time, sis." Maya smirked. "That's not a no." As she left, Malcolm leaned back in his chair, thinking. His father's struggle, His own fight, the lives that had been changed. No, this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning of something bigger. Justice wasn't a moment. It was a movement, and Malcolm Carter was just getting started.